Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for coming to the Faculty Conversation Lunch. The Faculty Conversations began in 1999 when Father Morrison asked our office to gather faculty from across the Midwest and Southern Jesuit universities to have a weekend of conversation about what it means to teach in this tradition. And in the 15 years since we've started, we've had 75 faculty go through, and in recent years, we've asked them to come back and do this and share what they learned, share their experiences at with their colleagues, with us. I will briefly introduce the panel. They used to be very generic topics about Jesuits and teaching, and in recent years, they have gone with the January issue of Conversation magazine sets the topic for what the weekend will be about. And this year it was about the 200th anniversary of the restoration of the Society of Jesus. Our panelists, Bridget Keegan, who is the Dean of Arts and Sciences, Tracy Leavelle, who is in the History Department, Heather Fryer in the History Department, Jose Miguel Lemus, who is in the Modern Languages and Literature, and Nate Romano, who is a Jesuit scholastic serving in the law school right now. I will turn this over to Bridget Keegan, who will serve as the moderator and person who holds the microphone.
It's a big responsibility, Maureen. Well, I want to start first by thanking Maureen and Andy for this amazing opportunity that the five of us had to attend this meeting of the Heartland-Delta Conference and to learn and to get to know each other better. It just was a really terrific experience all around. And thank all of you today for coming and listening and letting us relive and share about that experience. What I wanted to do to start is to share an image, a painting, by the artist Holly Shapker, who is, I think, is she faculty at Xavier, or she's an alum at Xavier, but also a very gifted artist. And she did a series of paintings, many of you may know them, based on the life of St. Ignatius, called Ad Sum, which means here I am. And I'll speak more about the paintings in a minute. The poem I want to read is one that was written by my very favorite living American poet, and that is a woman named Mary Oliver. And she's a beautiful poet about nature and about spirituality, one of the best actual kind of artists and thinkers about animals in a way. And this is a poem about an animal, and it's a poem that's 2 days late, but I thought was still maybe appropriate. And the poem is called "The Poet Thinks About the Donkey." On the outskirts of Jerusalem, the donkey waited. Not especially brave or filled with understanding, he stood and waited. How horses, turned out into the meadow, leap with delight. How doves, released from their cages, clatter away, splashed with sunlight. But the donkey, tied to a tree as usual, waited. Then he let himself be led away. Then he let the stranger mount. Never had he seen such crowds, and I wonder if he had all imagined what was to happen. Still, he was what he had always been, small, dark, obedient. I hope, finally, he felt brave. I hope, finally, he loved the man who rode so lightly upon him as he lifted one dusty hoof and stepped, as he had to, forward. So that poem, which I read yesterday, really made me think about one of the many moving images that Holly shared with us as a kickoff to the conference, and that is a painting that is just entitled simply Donkey, and it's an image of the donkey that Ignatius rode on, and at one point, as many of you know, he just decided to let the donkey choose the path that he would go down. So kind of act of faith, an act of trust, an act of obedience in many ways. So I thought these two poems would be a nice way to start. The reason I start with a poem and with a painting is because what the weekend reaffirmed for me, among other things, was the absolute crucial importance of imagination and creativity for the success of the Jesuit mission, and in particular for the success of the Jesuit mission in education. I think, we tend to associate Jesuits with the intellect, their academics, but really the success of the order, the success of the mission of the order from its inception and certainly after the Restoration was due in part to tremendous use of imagination, to tremendous use of creativity. And so for me, the takeaway, and we had a lot of different perspectives about the Restoration from the disciplines of history, media studies, philosophy. What am I forgetting? There was one more. I have a list of the presentations. I'm embarrassed. I think that was it, yeah, and the arts. Really, that theme of creativity rang true. And I want to say a couple words, and I really encourage you to go to Holly Shapker's website so that you can look at some of these images, and I just wanted to share some of them with you. We were able, our merry band of pilgrims, to make it through the snowstorm, to survive the brutal purgatory that is O'Hare, and make it safely to Cincinnati. Some of our colleagues from other Jesuit schools and colleges were not so lucky. Our colleague from Rockhurst didn't make it out of KC. I think the snow was worse there. But we had our first night. We had a lovely dinner with the group, enjoyed that, and then we were bused, and we say a lot of prayers of thanksgiving for that bus driver who took us around in the snow, bused over to the beautiful offices of Xavier's Mission and Ministry. And it's just, have any of you been there and seen that building? It's in there, it's right in their new campus center, very central, really sends a great message. And hanging on the walls of Xavier's Mission and Ministry office were some but not all of the paintings in Holly's series that I mentioned called Ad Sum. And it was just a wonderful kickoff for us to have a chance to have some cake pops and look at the art, and then hear a really beautiful talk from Holly, who shared about how her experience of doing the spiritual exercises really inspired her in her art, not only in the conception of the artwork, but in the actual execution of it. So it was just really fascinating to hear from a practicing visual artist how they integrated Ignatian spirituality into what they did. And I'll show you some of the images and maybe say a couple of words about them, but the hard thing about to capture, particularly in a small screen and in a representation, is these images, and my colleagues can jump in if they want. There's layers to them. There's textures. They're like palimpsests in a way, and that as you get closer, you can see other patterns emerge, and I'll mention a couple of them, and as you step away, other things become clear. And I was so inspired by them that I got back, and poor Andy and Maureen, I said, I want to bring Holly to campus. I want to have her, show her work here and give a talk. It's the 50th anniversary of Fine and Performing Arts. We need to bring her here. So we'll see if I'm successful in that goal, but I really hope that you get to not only enjoy the images on screen, but get to see them someday in person. So this is one of the ones I think that spoke to a few of us. It's the old woman at Manresa. And again, she takes moments in Ignatius's journey about, people or things that happened that really affirmed for him that, he was going in the direction that God wanted him to go. And this woman, of course, was one who was a help and support to him along the way. This one, again, the kind of tree of life, again, evoking the Garden of Eden story. Really, I think for Holly, she talked about how it's about, the choices that we're given, and we have free will and we have free choice, and how to think about exercising that gift of free will every day. This is one I really loved, and again, this is one where you can't appreciate the textures, but it's Ignatius at Manresa, and again, it's another one of the moments where he had an epiphany. And he had that epiphany from just contemplating nature and the beauty of nature. So you see him here with butterflies. And of course, butterflies, as I'm learning from my 5-year-old right now, are symbols of transformation and an important metaphor there. There's one more I want to show before I turn it over to Tracy. And this, I think, is one of my favorites. And again, it's one of the richest images. And I'm going to make sure I get the title right. It's just Portrait of Ignatius. So imagine that. One of the things, and again, you can't really appreciate it from a distance here, is that in Ignatius's cloak, and it looks like a beautiful blue coat, but they're actually maps, and maps of places that he visited. And it's, Holly talked about how it's showing his commitment to Our Lady of the Way, to being guided by God in his journeys. And I really love this image. There's another image that I think also we love too, of the shoes, of Ignatius's shoes. So here's this very beautiful, glorious image of him and symbolizing his travels. To look at these worn, traveled, beaten down shoes. I mean, that's also what it means to be a pilgrim. That's also what it means to go on this journey. So that's something that the textures and the physicality of the image of what it means to be a pilgrim, and probably the pain and discomfort of those shoes as well, spoke to me. So I don't want to say anything more, but I just would invite you, and I think I can send to Andy and Maureen, and they can distribute the website for Holly, and hopefully in the next year or so we'll be successful in bringing her to campus and can celebrate, and you can see these beautiful images yourself. But as I said, this was just a wonderful kickoff. I mean, we felt so inspired after looking at these images. We felt alive, we felt more creative. So it was just a wonderful way to start the weekend. So I'm going to turn it over to Tracy, who will talk about some other things.
Okay, thank you for coming. I should say, I hadn't thought about this since we came back, but Bridget is really fast when she runs through an airport. It was impressive. And we made all of our connections, surprisingly. So I don't have images, and I'm going to try to get through this pretty fast because the chicken smells really good. I just want to go over a little bit of the basic history of the suppression and restoration, because it was an important theme for what we were doing, to think about the history of the society, the restoration of the order in 1814, and the implications of that history for Jesuit higher education in the present. We have to start with the suppression if you want to understand the restoration. And I've written a little bit about this because my first book was about the Society of Jesus, French Jesuit missionaries in New France and North America. And I actually end the book with the expulsion, with the conquest of New France and the expulsion of the Jesuits from North America, because it's a convenient stopping point for me for what I was doing. But that's certainly not the end of Jesuit history in North America, as we know. So if we want to look at the causes of the suppression, there's a lot of reasons that can be given, and even Jesuits were trying to understand what was happening in retrospect during the suppression. So I'll run through a couple of these elements. The Enlightenment critique of the church, which had gained a lot of momentum in the 18th century. Some people equate this with increasing secularization, but I think it's much more complex than that. I don't think that's, I think that's an overly simplistic explanation. It's certainly important. Increasing nationalism. There was a lot of frustration with the continuing power of the church within European nations. And then hostility to Jesuit influence, and this included political influence, moral influence because of their educational mission, and economic power. And the Jesuits represented a very powerful international organization linked to Rome during a time when a lot of European monarchs were trying to consolidate their power over the state. So this, for some people, seemed incompatible. Inside the church, some resented Jesuit power and critiqued what they believed to be unorthodox practices, for example, in Jesuit missions, for being lax in their work with indigenous peoples around the world. So there was also a criticism coming from within the church. And then one of the interesting ones, I think, that Jesuits at the time, during this period, considered very important was they felt that pride had gotten in the way of the proper development of the society, and that in some ways they were being punished for that sin of pride. So the suppression, the first nation to expel the Jesuits was Portugal in 1759. And we can think about how important Portugal was to the Jesuit order, to the founding of the Jesuit order, with Francis Xavier and the extensive mission system around the world with a lot of Portuguese missionaries, the number of colleges that they ran inside Portugal. France in 1764, so that's kind of when I end my book. The society was incredibly influential and powerful in France and popular in some quarters. There were about 3,000 members in 1764 of the Society of Jesus in several provinces and 90 colleges in the country. So this was an extensive Jesuit network that was destroyed. Spain, 1767, the birthplace of Ignatius. And then finally, the big blow, the general suppression, Clementine's papal brief, Dominus ac Redemptor, in 1773, ended the order in a formal way for the church. There were about 22,500 Jesuits worldwide at mid-century, and innumerable colleges and missions. So you can imagine the sense of exile and loss that the men of the order suffered during that period. Some were imprisoned, some were exiled to various places, and some took up other kinds of positions just to make their lives work. Well, interestingly, and this is something I did not know until this weekend in Cincinnati, that I just had, I guess, thought that the society did not operate at all from 1773 to 1814, but that's not true, because in Russia, the Russian rulers refused to promulgate the brief, which allowed the society to function there. And actually, so during the Restoration, the infrastructure that had remained in Russia helped support the rebirth of the order, which I think is very interesting. Okay, so finally, Pope Pius VII restored the society in August of 1814 and created a generally more cautious and conservative order. So what about implications and patterns? And I don't really typically, as a historian, like to think about lessons so much, because I don't think we're very good at learning lessons of history. But implications and patterns. I think one is that no institution of any size or complexity can avoid entanglement with broader social and political concerns. And that can be seen as a very negative thing in some ways if you're really trying to stay focused on your mission. But on the other hand, in the Jesuit example, I've always seen this as the order promoting a kind of practical spirituality for living in the world as it exists, even as you maintain this vision for a world that is something better and more positive. So I've always admired that. In the US context, the Restoration represented actually very good timing because you had an expansive nation with a growing Catholic population and an interest in missions to American Indians. So the Restoration and growth of the order in the United States came at a very good time. So I just did a quick calculation, and within the first century, so by 1914, 25 of the existing 28 Jesuit institutions were in operation. That's an astonishing amount of growth. So I guess the last thing I would say is just how impressed I was with the continuing commitment of our colleagues from across the nation to the Jesuit Educational Mission. And I really, really appreciate the invitation that I received to participate in this with this group, and I appreciate Father Lannon's support of this faculty conversation. I'll turn it over to Heather, who's going to talk about St. Ignatius as a model for our students.
So often, as many of you may have experienced, when academic professionals get together at conferences and they're just getting to know each other, the first line of conversation is usually something about, students do the darndest things. What kind of darned things do your students do? And so at the conference, we had a little bit of that, combined with this wonderful art presentation that Bridget talked about. And the combination of thinking about our students and thinking about their needs, and then thinking about this really wonderfully accessible image of St. Ignatius as a person that you could walk up to and talk to, started us thinking about, now we would love to find some really great role models to get students to do the kinds of things that we would like them to do and to care about the things that we would like them to care about. Where would we ever find a role model like that? And as the conversation continued, it was really in the biography of St. Ignatius, which offers a lot to our students if we foregrounded the life as well as the charisms and the ideas. Because, as we talked about it, St. Ignatius was, well, a foreign student. He did study abroad, so if that's something that we value, this might be somebody who is an example to follow. He was a non-traditional age student by quite a bit, actually, when he was studying in Paris, also a veteran. A student with disabilities, someone who was undecided for quite a while, though he did eventually pick a major, and we want students to do that. And someone who is very much a model of someone who was in search of knowledge and purpose, and less asking questions about how do I get an A or do the right thing or that sort of thing. And looking at this, it's reached some of our concerns about how do we continue to make a Jesuit education clear and inclusive as the changing in higher education landscape starts to really show itself in many different ways. He's someone who would be an accessible model for students, I think, because he's someone who was on a transformational journey. And we really hope for our students that they see their time with us as a transformational journey and not a credentialing process so much. That it's a journey that's painful, that it's not a problem or bad if things are not going well, but struggling with yourself a bit. You know, surrendering your sword, facing your limitations, your fears, your anxieties, instead of trying to take courses around it or avoid them. Dealing with yourself, your own ego, so that your education serves a larger purpose. Again, is something that's very clear in the story. St. Ignatius was someone who really had to reframe who he thought he was so that he could become the person that he wanted to be. I don't recommend that they actually have terrible injuries to their legs, but something other than that. And if we had a common vocabulary based on the biography, we could actually potentially do some great messaging that would be meaningful for our students and very clear. So some of the ones that came out of these conversations, I can't take credit for all of them, but hey, study everything because the divine is everywhere and you don't want to miss it. But the asterisk says, but it's probably not on your Instagram, or at least not all the time. Hey, pay attention and follow the donkey. It's in a classroom that's often very technology rich and students whose attention is fragmented all over the place. It can be hard to explain why that's potentially not always the way to do things. Bringing back the art of just listening to people and being present to your environment and letting occur what occurs is going by the wayside in the classroom. And I think that rather than telling students not to do this, show them the alternate experience and an example of what that can do. Giving students an example of if you live and work with purpose, then your classes are just not going to be so much of a pain. If it's not so much about getting done what you have to do, but thinking about who you'll become and what you'll be able to do for the world, to really put yourself in service and what that means by his example. Gather your friends, study together, start a movement of regular folks with a divine purpose. I know there's controversy about his not having a theology degree, but starting something is a good thing, and we're really equipped to do that here. Even looking at the message that what college is about is that there's something amazing in all of us, as there was in St. Ignatius. But the thing is you have to work for it, and you have to search for it, and you have to be open to seeing it when it arrives. And you have to be willing to share it generously. But that, again, is really what college could be and what it could be for, beyond credentialing. And how do we know that it might work for students as a way of kind of re-messaging or repackaging? Because students are actually starting to take the mandate to innovate, create, and adapt to your era and circumstances by starting to make St. Ignatius their own. Now, there is a little controversy about whether putting Mardi Gras t-shirts on him is exactly the way to go, and I'm not really endorsing that. It's just the best picture I could find. But I think that there's some possibilities here for really taking the biography and making it part of our campus popular culture and part of our common vocabulary for all of our students. So again, the weekend for me was very fruitful, very enjoyable, and I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to go.
As you see, the title of this reflection is more like a set of notes that I gathered during our presentation in Cincinnati. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Father Landon for the invitation to participate in this faculty conversation. As new faculty member in Creighton, this experience has been pleasant and enlightening at the same time. Last February, as you know, a delegation of 5 professors from Creighton University attended the 2014 Heartland-Delta Faculty Conversations weekend at Xavier University at Cincinnati. As you know, the Heartland-Delta Conference is formed by 11 of the 28 colleges and universities with Jesuit tradition in the United States. I'm going to use the alphabetic order because that favors Creighton in the top of the list. So this is the alphabetic order of the institutions represented there. As you can see, the conference includes universities around the delta of the Mississippi River, from Milwaukee to New Orleans. Together, this institution serves around a number of 85,000 students. The official title of the conference was The History of the Society of Jesus and Its Implications for Jesuit Education Today, celebrating 200 years of restoration. I attended the conference inspired by the words of Father Alexander in our meeting previous to the trip. He invited us to see this conference, yes, as a celebration, but also as an opportunity to reflect on the causes and consequences of both the suppression and the restoration of the Company of Jesus. And of course, its implications for today's work in education, our work. I have to admit that I was surprised when I received the invitation in the first place. I had to attribute this invitation to a casual and very brief conversation with Professor Keegan 2 years ago when I first came to Creighton, and mentioned to her that I wrote my dissertation on the 18th century colonial newspapers in New Spain. And apparently that was enough for her to remember 2 years later my field of scholarship. But I also mentioned to her I work with service learning in Spanish, and I get to learn more about, as I learn more about the Jesuit approach to education, I find more and more connections between the idea of service learning and the Jesuit mission. So I decided to attribute also this invitation to my work linking our students' practice of Spanish with the Latino community. But there's still another reason, because I thought I have maybe been invited to Xavier University. You know, I was a reporter for many years in Mexico, and as you could notice in these pictures, I very soon became officially the photographer for the Creighton's delegation in Cincinnati. But as a reporter, I not just take pictures, I also take notes. And not just notes about the information presented on the conference, but also notes about the commentaries, formal and informal, given by colleagues attending the conversation. I also take notice trying to capture the atmosphere, the spirit, and the general mood of the conference. Please allow me to share with you 5 short notes about our weekend in Cincinnati. During the 3 days of the conversation, one question was posted recurrently for the participants. What were the causes of the suppression of the Company of Jesus? Most of the speakers facing this central issue enlisted a complex set of political, economic, and social causes, which led to the drastic measures taken by the Vatican in 1773. However, most of the speakers agree also in one key internal cause that contributed to the suppression of the company, That was called, that cause was within the company was called pride. Pride goes before the fall, says the proverb. And some of the speakers concur on identifying the excessive sense of self-sufficient as an internal factor for the suppression. When the Company of Jesus was established in 1814, the world had changed already. Therefore, the restoration could not be a simple return to the previous state of things before the suppression. The company had to seek compatibility with republics and democracies and new political systems. New rules in a new world reshape internally the Jesuit institutions. A more cautious and deliberative organization emerged from the suppression. For countries like New Spain and many others in what we call now Latin America, the role of the Company of Jesus was one of enormous proportions. I know firsthand, and most specialists agreed in the fact that Jesuits contribute to the invention of new national identities in Latin America. For scholars like David Brading, the first genuine movement of national proportions in New Spain was the people's reaction to the expulsion of the Jesuits from the Spanish Empire in 1767. During our week in Cincinnati, in many formal conversations, one observation was recurring. In recent years, the role of non-Jesuits has grown exponentially in Jesuit institutions. Long-standing participants describe this number of non-Jesuits working in colleges and universities as, quote-unquote, dramatic transformation. That transformation leads to an important consideration. More and more people working in institutions like the one represented in this Heartland-Delta conference are not necessarily aware of the rich history, tradition, and long-term commitment to education established by the Company of Jesus. How the ordinary becomes extraordinary. How the constant, humble, consistent effort to go beyond our own limitations can create something bigger than us. For me, one of my favorite moments during the weekend was knowing the remarkable and inspiring work of Father Greg Boyle working in favor of those in the margins. As they say in the conference, Jesuit education can restore the sense of community in a world spinning on individualism. One final reflection based on one question. How good the world would be today if the restoration never occurred? How a world without a Company of Jesus would be? It is part of our job to try to answer this question every day from the perspective of our work. At the Heartland-Delta conference, I had a brief insight about the geographical scope of the Jesuit institutions in the Midwest. And I also have a brief perception of the historical deepness of the company's mission. With the geographical awareness comes the consciousness of where we are. With the historical awareness comes the consciousness of when we are. So we are here and we are now. We are part of a long, rich tradition of education, social transformation, a commitment to help others.
So what I wanted to talk about was, as a Jesuit delegation and one of the few Jesuits at the conference itself, sort of reflections as a Jesuit on what does our history mean in the context of higher education. And I'm going to just preface this with a few remarks. I am a young Jesuit, not just in age, but also in terms of how long I've been in the society. It'll be 6 years this August. I'm still in formation. I am still in the process of becoming a Jesuit, and I've been involved in higher education on the non-student side now for less than 8 months. So take that with a grain of salt. If you stop by the Jesuit dining room and ask any of the other men there what their experience is like, they may or may not give the same answer. If you tell them this is the answer I gave, they will not give you the same answer. So that's just our preface. But there were a couple of points that jumped out at me both during the weekend and as in the month since I've reflected on it. And the first one of this is that we call it a restoration of the society, but really it's almost a reincarnation, right? The restoration happened 40 years after the suppression, and although there was this sort of remnant in Russia and in a few other places milling around, the men who became Jesuits after 1814 had very little living history and living tradition. They were left with documents and maybe some memories, distant memories, and some older men who had spent 40 years as not Jesuits engaged with that. So it was for them rediscovering what it meant to be sons of Ignatius, to be living this apostolic life. And for Jesuits today, particularly for those of us who are young Jesuits looking forward to what we will be like in 10, 20, 40 years, we can say that this means every generation has to renew itself and make the society its own society and its engagement with the church and the broader world different. Now, luckily, we don't have a 40-year exodus of men. We do have this living tradition, and for me personally, it's wonderful, here at Creighton especially, to have that life and men who've been here for so long. So we're not in the same boat, but it is a difference, and it is the way to remember what's going on. The second point that I had was that collaboration between Jesuits and the church and Jesuits and our lay colleagues is about more than just doing the same work together. It involves communication, it involves honesty and transparency, and it involves freedom, right? There was a lot going on that led up to the suppression. There was a lot going on that led up to the restoration. And that can be difficult and that can be scary, and particularly Jesuits enter into the society and you spend a lot of time focused on other Jesuits and focused on your community and focused on life in a particular way, but then they let us loose into the world, and we have to realize that we're dealing not only with non-Jesuit priests and religious sisters, we're dealing with non-clerics, we're dealing with lay women and men who have different experiences, we're dealing with non-Catholics, non-Christians. And to treat them as though we would treat other Jesuits is not always going to work out for the best. It requires us having the freedom to give what we've been given, but also to know that what's going to happen is an appropriation of that by our colleagues and our collaborators. One of the great, for me, presentations of the weekend was Daniel Hendrickson, who is a Jesuit priest at Marquette University. He spoke about models of pedagogy for Jesuit institutions, and he said what Jesuits can offer is sort of this role of formation, that as young Jesuits we go through 10 to 12 years of training before becoming priests and in our final vows and moving forward. He said we can use that model to give that to our colleagues at our universities. And that can be then appropriated in different ways. Now, it's not always going to look the same, and I don't know if that particular model would work in any particular place. I don't want to get into the merits of that. But that idea that we can offer who we are to everyone out there and let that be appropriated was really, I think, a powerful notion of what it could be for Jesuits today. And the final point, the final reflection that I thought had a little to do with the substance of the weekend as opposed to the existence of the weekend. And just looking out and realizing here we were talking about Jesuit history and Jesuit education today, and it wasn't a bunch of men dressed like this telling all of you out there what you needed to do. It was a real collaboration and a real communication and a real community between Jesuits and lay colleagues from all over these institutions. The presenters included Jesuits and non-Jesuits, and the conversations included Jesuits and non-Jesuits. And there was no claim from anybody that just because I'm this or just because you're that, you're better or worse than somebody else. And as somebody looking forward to life in the society and life in higher education, that was just really impressive and really just fantastic for me. So anyway, so those are, like I said, some thoughts, and I think give this back to.
I don't know if we have time for any questions or comments or reflections about.
Please thank our group.
Yeah. But I'm sure that my colleagues would be happy if you had anything you wanted to inquire about or share. Yes?
I was just wondering if any of you made any kind of promise to yourself or to your work that you brought back to Creighton, or something that you'd like to share besides, this is wonderful and great. I just wondered if there's any changes you might make in your work or something you might add to your time here at Creighton?
I think I already made the commitment about getting the artist here, so I'll pass along to my colleagues. Nate, do you want to just maybe go down?
Sure. I think for me, a lot of it was as I move forward in my training and my life here at Creighton and the rest of my formation, how can I keep these moments of cooperation and really good cooperation alive, and how can I really engage with my non-Jesuit colleagues, and how can I help get my Jesuit brothers to engage constructively with our non-Jesuit colleagues?
There were a lot of historians there that weekend because of the topic. And it occurred to me that I don't know that much about my historian colleagues at other Jesuit institutions, and I would like to know more. We met some really amazing people, and I think we in the history department would like to get some of them here, or maybe figure out ways to collaborate. And I know that there are disciplines that already do that, but maybe there's some new ways that we could think about collaborating.
Let's see if I can go this way. I also just made a decision that I want Heather to make her presentation at every admitted student's day.
And I would do that. Because really, I mean, the conference for me also gave me a different look at the richness of the tradition in Jesuit higher education. And I think that alongside so many conversations recently about how to deal with or resist or ignore the changing higher education landscape really got me excited about thinking about, well, maybe it's a moment for reinvention, and that could be a really fun, energizing conversation to have. I've had it in the hallway a few times, and some people are, think that's interesting, and I've had a few kind of like, so we'll see.
Thank you. I just want to add something about the wonderful presentation Heather gave us. St. Ignatius also was a modern and classical language student, so it's part of my field.
For study foreign language.
Yeah. So, well, I think just try to keep fresh this spirit of the conference. Remember is not a way to express, remember is for the mind, but I was trying to keep fresh this spirit, this mood of the conference, the people collaborating, trying to learn, being part of the community that has a long tradition and is a big geographical area. For me, that was important to bring.
Yes.
I think Heather's presentation would be valuable for the board of directors.
Yes.
That would be an interesting conversation to have, actually.
Roger.
I just read the New York Times this weekend that, according to some polls, that the one thing that parents are most concerned about in terms of the education of their children is not achievement, but they become caring people.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And it seems to me that the way higher education, including Creighton, markets itself now is that we will help you become an achieving person. You will get a better return on your investment at a place like Creighton than you will somewhere else. And I'm just thinking maybe that's not true. That approach is not addressing some of the deepest concerns people have. And it seems like we bury that, And instead of lifting up, we will help you become a more caring person. We have programs of formation that are the context in which you get credentialed pre-professionally and professionally. I just feel like we're fighting this battle all the time, and that what Jesuit education has to offer is a formation in caring and service and justice, and that means you can be a great dentist or whatever it is. But okay, end of rant.
Well, I think, and I think one of the things that we talked about, and Heather presented it so beautifully, was, the story of Ignatius, and just reminding, and we all kind of know it in different ways, we have to, we have the statue and stuff, but really just, using that as a kind of point of reflection, a point of imagination, and leading with that story. We have the beautiful statue here, but to what extent do we, dare I say the word, market, that story and the power of that story and the way in which that story, the dimensions of it, I think, as Heather pointed out so beautifully, can touch so many different lives. I love the idea, and I hadn't really thought about it. You know, he's a veteran. And wouldn't that be a great way to say, you know, this is a school founded by a veteran. He gets it. He understands what it is to be wounded, spiritually and physically. You are welcome here. You know, and so that to me, again, you know, just in adult students too, I think, you know, we're maybe not as welcoming to them as we could be sometimes. That's another thing that's really powerful. So I don't know, Heather, if you want to say anything else.
Actually, no, because you just said it so well.
Dennis.
Well, just to build on that, I mean, I really love the idea of making the life story part of the culture, of our student culture. And to that end, I want to say something about the donkey, because I think it's really important to understand the narrative context of that donkey episode. It's an example of profound immaturity. It should be encouraging to us when we find our own students immature, because the situation was that he fell into an argument with a Muslim about Blessed Virgin Mary, and he heard the Muslim as being quite derogatory regarding Our Lady, and his immediate response was to kill the guy. And he decided, in a movement of really weird prudence, to let the donkey decide. That if the donkey followed after the insulter, he would kill the guy. If the donkey took the other road, he would let the Muslim live. I mean, when you state the development of conscience, this is a pretty low level. Leave it to the donkey. So, I mean, that can encourage us regarding if we think, my God, these students, they're hopeless. They're out of touch. They haven't begun to think about the real issues. Well, we got a great example of a man who was probably about 25 or 30 at that point, who had lots of distance to go.
Mm-hmm. And not perfect. I mean, that's something that's important, that you don't have to be perfect right away, that it is a journey. I don't know, Heather, if you want to, I'll give it to you.
We probably have time for one more word or expression. Thank you very much. And there are many resources on the web. If you wanted to explore this further, if you Google the restoration of the society, you'll see a conference at Loyola Chicago that was last fall. Father Padberg gave 5 hours of review of the history of the suppression and restoration. There's almost nothing better anywhere. But there are many, many things, including that issue of conversations, if you haven't had a chance to look at it. And it's also online if you lost your copy. But there are many things on the web that can continue this discussion. There's going to be another conference at Loyola New Orleans this summer, I believe, on this topic. And I'm sure that will be worth paying attention to as well. But thank you very, very much.